Hello and welcome to our Week 8 Overview Lecture. This is our final week in our politics theme. We'll move on to economics next week. We'll be picking up in this week a number of the strands that we've discussed over the last couple of weeks. Like last week, a lot of the readings for this week have videos that were recorded by the authors who wrote them or by people interviewing those authors. So you've got a very big selection of material to look at in the supplemental folder. In this lecture, I just want to walk through an overview of the readings that are available and how they fit together. There's a little bit more arbitrariness this week than most weeks to where things were classified. A lot of these authors are talking to each other and also talking to authors from last week in ways that enable a large number of different organizations. And you'll find that if you're going to write on this topic, you can find quite a lot of people talking to one another about different themes across weeks 7 and 8 in. So we have three topics that the readings are organized into. The first is liberal democracy triumphant, with a question mark on the end, and it's an examination of different authors trying to work out what it means that on the one hand you get a relatively dominant form of political system and form of political ideals that seems to be acknowledged globally after the end of the Cold War. But on the other hand, it's a little uncertain what it means to think about this form of government in a global context. There are certain kinds of claims, particularly claims to justice of the sort that we discussed when we talked about roles last week, that are a little uncertain how we might realize on a global scale. So we have authors from across the political spectrum in this topic wrestling with these sorts of issues. We then have a theme covering some of the literature on cosmopolitanism, which is a really big topic. It's referred to in some of the other readings that are classified under other headings this week. But it's basically the question of, do we have an obligation to be world citizens, forming some kind of world government? And if we do have that kind of obligation, what would that look like? And so we've got a selection of authors taking a look at that question. And then we've got our biggest topic in terms of number of authors here, which is called Challenging Liberal Democracy. And this topic is a collection of people, some of whom are critics of liberal democracy, either critics in an absolute term, in the sense that they're trying to criticize the ideal itself, or more frequently critics of how these ideals are being implemented or whether they're being implemented in our current period, in our current nation states, as well as some people who are analyzing recent critiques of liberal democracy and trying to work out what makes these critiques tick and whether the critiques have any warrant to them. So I'll just run through the individual works in these categories now. So in terms of our first topic, Francis Fukuyama is our sort of pivotal figure here. His piece is actually the one that provokes the piece by Huntington that we looked at in week 7. If you read the piece on the clash of civilizations, it is in part a response to Fukuyama. Fukuyama in this piece is putting forward what he considers to be a Hegelian conception of history, influenced by someone named Kojève. And Fukuyama's Hegelian conception of history says that history is understood to be a process that is driven by contradiction. So by history, Fukuyama doesn't mean stuff that happens in time. He means a very specific directional trajectory of historical change. And for Fukuyama, he believes that Hegel thinks this trajectory is driven by ideas and by contradictions within ideas. And Fukuyama says that through much of the 20th century, it looked like there were challenges to liberal democracy that might be viable. There was fascism and there was communism. Fascism is defeated in World War II and communism is falling as Fukuyama is writing this piece. And he believes that the defeat of these major potential opponents has generated a historical period in which liberal democracy shows no major contradictions, it has no major challenges on the world scale, and therefore it's in a triumphant period that Fukuyama suggests might mean the end of history, or a period without major conflicts. And what Fukuyama means by this is he thinks that you might still get conflicts on the periphery, you might still get conflicts in the third world, you might still get conflicts between countries in the periphery and countries that are at the end of history, because those other less developed countries for Fukuyama are still in history. And many of the people that we'll take a look at this week are going to be kicking back on this in various ways. It's a piece that's written for a sort of foreign policy magazine, so the reading level's not that difficult. Some of the names may be a bit unfamiliar to you. We do have an interview with him that's summarizing the piece in the supplemental lectures folder. Mary Kaldor is taking up the question of whether there is something different about the kinds of conflict that we have in this period. So Fukuyama suggests that you will have a change in the kind of conflict, and he's got a particular theory of what that change would be. Kaldor has another, and what she's doing in this piece is summarizing her concept of new wars. This is not a concept that is unique to her. She's part of a literature that's making this suggestion. And criticisms of that concept, people who think that maybe there's not anything that new, or that the kinds of things she's drawing attention to aren't really wars, they're just sort of criminal activities. But she says that the concept of there being new kinds of wars is important for how we orient to contemporary conflicts and how we think they can be resolved. She says it's important to realize you've got different sorts of actors. In particular, not all the actors are based in nation states. You've got particular goals and strategies that are not the same as in older forms of wars between nation states. She argues in particular that the goal of new wars is not victory over the other side, but perpetual conflict that enables all of the sides in the conflict to enact specific identities. Okay, and so for her, this is quite different from what is part of the conventional theory of warfare, and therefore policy initiatives that you might enact, or responses that you might have to it, or ways that you interpret what's going on are going to have to change. Thomas Nagel is yet another intervention into this debate with Rawls that we began looking at next week. A lot of our figures this week are talking to Rawls as well. It's a long piece, but it's a fairly clear one, and it's specifically revisiting the question of justice, revisiting ideas from Rawls and Hobbes, okay, that are understood to be slightly contradictory figures, asking whether we should be looking at cosmopolitan ideals of global government. And Nagel, like many of our authors this week, is drawing attention to the global character of a lot of the problems we currently face, and is saying, look, in light of that global character, should we be looking at something like cosmopolitanism? He says that, at least at the moment, the answer to that question is no, that nation-states are the viable institutions we have, and they are the only institutions, for Nagel, that can meaningfully be the recipients of a request for justice. So he doesn't think that you can defend the cosmopolitan conception, but what he does end up saying is that the reason we got to this point, that we have nation-states that we can put justice claims to, is that initially you had an earlier historical period where some group took power, and the taking of power was not itself always legitimate, but once the power was there, you could start directing these sorts of claims for justice to it. So he suggests quite provocatively at the end of this piece that we may just need to build up international institutions that may in fact be illegitimate and unjust in the first instance, but they'll provide a focus for future contestations over justice. So it's a quite provocative piece if you make your way through it. Then we have Amartya Sen. We read a bit of Sen last week, engaging with Rawls. Here he's analyzing the rise of democracy as a universal value and as a watershed historical event that takes place in the course of the 20th century. He thinks this is quite historically distinctive, it's quite new. And he's responding to criticisms of this idea. He's responding to people who think that democracy is not particularly important to press for right now, that instead you should be looking at material factors to improve the lives of the poor. And he's also responding to critics who think that democracy is a cultural imposition from the outside on a lot of the third world. He doesn't think that either of these criticisms hold water, and in this sense he can be an interesting person to read against Mahbubani, who's one of the figures in topic 3 this week, who is probably one of the critics that Sen has in mind. Then we have Peter Singer. Many of you may have heard of him. He's an Australian ethicist, and he's looking at the global impact of the actions of nation-states and running through a series of fairly recent political examples at a level of complexity that you might get in a newspaper analysis. This is probably one of the easier pieces to read in this section. He's looking at these examples as ways to cast light on the limits of conceptions of justice like the ones put forward by Rawls that restrict themselves to the level of an individual nation state. And he's arguing that we need to come up with an ethics that is adequate to the global impact of the actions that we're making. Okay, so those are the authors in this topic. The second topic on cosmopolitanism, there's Danielle Archibugi, who's giving a comprehensive review of the debates around cosmopolitanism. So it's a long piece. It's meant to lay out the literature and schematize it and put it in order. It's a good overview piece, particularly if you're writing on this topic. And she tried to situate these debates in the context of globalization and debates over the significance of the Cold War and the apparent triumph of liberal democracy. So again, reacting to people like Fukuyama, who think that there's a very clear meaning and significance of this historical period, and arguing that things might be a bit more complex, and using the literature on cosmopolitanism to dig into that complexity. There's Jürgen Habermas, whom we met in week 2, who is, again, like many of these figures, looking at the kind of global social relation that has been developed by capitalism. And with a new global period of capitalism, we are increasingly integrated at an economic level. The problem for Habermas is that this global social relation responds only to price signals. It's relatively insensitive to other kinds of signals that people might be able to send. So if you don't have money, you're not able to express your voice, your desires in global capitalism. And he's analyzing the possibility of developing political institutions that would be effective in this globalized space, and he's thinking particularly with reference to the European Union. Then we have Martha Nussbaum. Nussbaum's probably the simplest reading within this category this week. It is an intervention, a debate with several figures that she's having, particularly interested in education and what kinds of citizens we're trying to develop. Are we trying to develop nationalistic citizens, or are we trying to develop citizens of the world? And she is advocating cosmopolitanism, that loyalty to a community of human beings over patriotism. She places the concept in its historical context, in a very long intellectual historical context, and also talks, like many of the authors this week, about the global nature of the problems that we're confronting right now. So again, it's probably the simplest of the readings from this category, although it's not an extremely easy piece. Then we have Kako Chan, who's arguing against the assumption that there's a necessary tension between liberal forms of nationalism on the one hand and cosmopolitanism on the other. And he's arguing that a particular kind, at least, of liberal nationalism is compatible with a particular kind of cosmopolitan notion of distributive justice. So he's arguing against people like Nagel from the previous topic. So he unpacks the diversity within these various traditions in order to try to come to a space where they have some overlap. Now, topic 3, there's a lot of reading choices. So if you're writing on the political theory, you've got a lot of choice in this particular area, looking at different kinds of critics. Agamben is an author who's drawing on a couple of other people that we've read earlier in the course. He's drawing particularly on Foucault and Schmitt. He also talks a bit about Arendt. And he's analyzing the tendency for modern nations to declare what he calls states of exception to their ostensible political principles. He's thinking about totalitarianism, but he's also thinking about things like the treatment of the refugees or other institutionalized populations that are managed within modern societies that claim to be liberal and democratic in character. He talks about the concentration camp as a sort of an archetypical modern social institution, and is trying to use figures like Foucault and Schmitt to make sense of the ways in which contemporary nation states make exceptions to their own apparent founding constitutional limitations. There's Alain Badiou with a very provocative piece arguing that the word democracy has come to function as a kind of a talisman. It's deflecting critical analysis. You are expected to be a Democrat, and so he makes a very provocative statement that we need to decide to be unpopular and not be Democrats. He thinks the term has come to disguise the existence of conservative oligarchies that currently hold power, and that a critique of democracy in the name of communism is now necessary. And again, he's a figure that would have been holding a position of a sort that's referred to in some of the earlier readings. Fukuyama is quite scathing of the fact that communism, Fukuyama says, is a dead idea except for this scattering of intellectuals around the place. So people like this will duel with Badiou. There's a very, very recent addition to the readings in this area. There's Martin Gillen's and Benjamin Pade's piece, which is an empirically oriented investigation, looking at the question of who rules, who holds power, that is a useful literature review. It summarizes a number of common theories about who might hold power, and then argues that just based on a number of indicators that it analyzes, that the paper analyzes, that the contemporary US needs to be seen as oligarchical on a number of significant measures. Okay, so it's just trying to make an empirical assessment of the degree to which the country is democratic. Michael Hart and Antonio Negri are taking a look at economic globalization and the way in which globalization is oftentimes described as a liberation of the market, as a freeing of market forces from interference by the state. And they argue that the discourse of liberation is misleading here, that you need to see it instead as the development of new forms of sovereignty. So there may be a genuine weakening of the nation-state and its distinctive forms of sovereignty, but there are new forms of what they will call empire associated with the development of the current round of economic globalization, and they analyze those in this piece. We also have another piece by Mahbubani, whom we read also in week 7. He is fighting with Fukuyama here. He was fighting with Huntington in the piece from week 7. Fukuyama has a conception that the third world remains in history, while the developed world has somehow escaped from it. Mahbubani is not particularly sympathetic to this idea. He also argues that the West ignores the third world at its peril. There are things going on in the third world that pose significant threats. And he is particularly critical of the way in which the West tries to intervene in third world contexts with demands for liberal democratic political reforms that Mahbubani thinks need to wait until economic development has been achieved first. Amartya Sen is critical of this kind of position in his reading from this week. Saba Mahmood is looking at tensions within contemporary US political discourse around secularism, arguing that these discourses may sound like they're oriented to toleration, but they're actually looking to drive the development and spread of forms of subjectivity that are compliant with liberal political rule. And she's asking whether we actually know whether other forms of religious belief are as incompatible with liberal democracy as these discourses assume. And she's also looking at the question, like Mahbubani in a way, of whether these sorts of discourses are doing more harm than good. C. Wright Mills is our oldest piece from this section this week. He's writing in the 50s, but it's a classic text, and in some ways it's a text that was updated by the by a couple of the other studies of oligarchy. It's one of the reasons that oligarchy is an interest for a number of the figures that we're reading this week. Mills is giving an analysis of the ways in which major social institutions, the state, corporations, and the military have come, he thinks, in the course of the 20th century to form interlocking administrative systems whose leadership comprises what Mills calls a power elite, with significantly more power and influence than other citizens. And he analyzes that elite as well as various hangers-on and supporters that don't themselves have exactly the same amount of power, but might be more visible to the public via communication technologies. And he analyzes those sort of structures. Then we have Chantal Mouffe. Mouffe is intervening, looking at rationalist critiques of postmodernism. She particularly has Habermas in mind as a direct critic, but she also has in mind rationalist understandings of liberal democracy like Rawls. Mouffe argues that a postmodern critique of essentialism is actually necessary to realize the pluralist dimensions within liberal democracy. So she thinks there's a pluralism at the heart of things, there's a multiplicity that can potentially be realized, but this requires certain postmodern tools. So she's part of a debate that we began running into all the way back in week 2 about whether there's something particularly damaging about postmodernism, whether it has some affinity with romantic or anti-modern conceptions. And she's arguing, no, that you actually need its tools for opening up the multiplicity of voices that we have within contemporary societies. Jacques Rancière is interested in the question of why there are so many people right now who hate democracy, why there's so many critics of democracy. He's going to look at the oligarchic character of modern institutions as one of the things that provokes what he calls an anti-democratic fury, but he's also quite interested in criticizing positions, and he has Agamben in mind fairly specifically here, but also some other positions that we're taking a look at this week that sort of act like there's no meaningful distinction between totalitarianism and various forms of oligarchy and the rest. Rancière would prefer an approach that looks for fragile, fleeting, but actually there democratic potentials that pop up in contemporary society. And then we have Roberto Unger, who's putting forward a program for what he calls democratic experimentalism, looking for alternatives to current neoliberal ideals. And he mentions something here that gets mentioned fairly frequently, the difficulty of thinking about alternatives. So the Soviet Union collapses, communism collapses as a major organizing ideal, and there is a large discussion, which we talked about a bit in previous weeks with reference to postmodernism and the notion of the collapse of meta-narratives. There is an absence of overarching big visions for what we might have next, other than a particular kind of liberal triumphalism. Unger is suggesting that we can develop alternatives. They need to bubble up through democratic experimentalism that can happen on a mass scale. So those are choices for this week. There's a lot of material in the supplemental lectures folder as well, so dig around in that if you'd like to, and we'll work through all of this in class.